Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriella Cisneros, and I'm the creative director at Porchlight Book Company. Porchlight is a local and family owned business in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with a book selling heritage of nearly 100 years. We customize book sales and services for organizations of any size and ship books directly to employees or clients, or in bulk to groups or events. We also have a blog where our editorial team curates nonfiction and business book recommendations through reviews, lists, excerpts, giveaways, and author interviews like the one today um, with Paige McClanahan on her brand new book, The New Tourist, Waking Up to the Power and Perils of Travel. So here's Paige. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before I let Paige do most of the talking, I'll give everyone a quick intro to the book because it literally just got published like 2 days ago. So we see a lot of articles, marketing content, and social media posts about why travel is so important for our happiness, our empathy, our education, and more. And we see so much content that romanticizes travel too, but we encounter surprisingly little information about balancing the benefits of travel for ourselves and with the impacts that travel has on the landscapes and communities that we visit. If we're going to consider travel essential and life changing, we have to understand the ways that it changes other people's lives as well. With insights gleaned from interviews with locals, leaders, journalists, and tour guides in various cities and scenic areas throughout the world, The New Tourist by Paige McClanahan comprehensively illustrates the gives and takes of tourism. And then my little one-liner is travel can dramatically shift someone's perspective of the world, but the book The New Tourist by Paige McClanahan shifts readers' perspectives of travel itself. So that's
Wow, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Gabby. That's fantastic.
So let's start talking about it. Well, let's first start with Paige. Can you introduce yourself and what you do and why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much again for having me on your show. And I'm an American journalist. I grew up in the United States, actually here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I am at the moment. But I'm just here visiting. I left the United States in 2008. And since then, I have moved around quite a bit. So not only have I made travel my profession, it's also been, a huge part of my personal life for the last 16 plus years. And so I started travel writing really in 2010. I was living in West Africa, and I prepared the second edition of the Brat Guide to Sierra Leone. So traveling all over the country and interviewing anybody and everybody who had anything to do with tourism in this small West African nation. And since then, started pitching, as a freelance journalist, writing travel features for the Washington Post. But I was also doing economic and political journalism at the same time. So for a long time, I was working as a journalist, kind of an economic and political stuff, and doing some travel writing kind of on the side at the same time. And it was really kind of in 2018 when I moved to a little village in the French Alps with my family that I kind of started to merge those two lines of my work and I started to take the kind of journalistic lens with which, I was writing on kind of economic and political spheres and turning that toward tourism, which of course is something that had always fascinated me and something that I'd always been, just really eager to do and to write about. But it was really in 2018, I moved with my family to this little village in the French Alps where travel and tourism was, and is the lifeblood of the local economy. So it became a resident in 2018 of a tourist destination. And just seeing the ways that tourism really brought life and energy, as well as income, of course, to this little village in, very remote corner of the French Alps. And also living as a resident, and living with the challenges that come with having a really strong local tourism industry. It just really kind of gave me a whole new level of appreciation for this huge phenomenon of tourism, which, of course, is an industry in some respects, but is also much, much bigger than just an industry. So it was really living in this village, and I was still doing my travel writing at that point for the New York Times. But then I started to pitch more articles, kind of looking at the nuances and the complexities of tourism. And like you were saying, I would see a lot of news articles that were, media, travel media that was either kind of like top 10 beaches in Brazil or Barcelona is overrun with tourists, like, don't go, it's bad. And I didn't see, especially, 2018, 2019, a whole lot of kind of nuance in between in the media. And I thought, this is a huge gap. This is like, it's really interesting. This is, a huge part of so many people's lives. How do we navigate this? How should we understand both the positives and the downsides of this thing in which so many of us are privileged to participate? And then, of course, with the pandemic, everybody stopped traveling. And I think coming back into traveling afterwards, a lot of people had a different mindset and were really ready to think about traveling. Like, we didn't take it for granted anymore. And I think since people are traveling again since the end of the pandemic, a lot of people are really they're just looking to be more thoughtful in their choices. And surveys show this as well. They want to make, have a good impact in the communities they're visiting. They want to make more sustainable travel choices. So it really felt like there was a moment for this. This is kind of like a good moment for this book. Because it speaks to like the person I wrote this for. I mean, I really wrote this book because I kind of wrote this book for me because I'm this person too. But I hope is somebody who loves travel, feels passionate about travel, and sometimes they're kind of conflicted about it, and they want to sort of figure out what to do with those complicated feelings. So I really hope the book is arriving at a moment where it will resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I realized I love travel too, and I never had the experience that you had of living first person in a place that became a tourist destination, which is what makes this book it really makes it different than travel guides and things. It's not a travel guide. It's really like a first person perspective in a lot of ways. Like your experience, you start with your experience living in your town in the French Alps, and then you bring in these other people's first person experiences, and it's really like thoughtful and emotional, but also has all of the research that makes a book impactful and really I think it will enact change in anyone, at least in like if you're thoughtful about the way that you travel. Like, yeah, it really changed me, I think.
Oh, wow. Oh, Gabby, that like I am deeply touched to hear that. That's, I mean, my goal, my approach, let's say, in writing the book, it was like, okay, I want to really, always my first goal as a writer is I need to hold your attention. Like if I don't hold your attention, like nothing else matters, right? I need to hold your attention. So I'm like, I want to take people on like a journey with me that's going to be hopefully kind of captivating and engrossing. And we're going to kind of do some scary things, have some fun, and sort of like meet some interesting people. So I wanted to, include that first person, like include myself as the kind of like the narrator guide, to just kind of invite people to come along on this journey with me as I explore these things and I make mistakes and I learn and I meet people who challenge me. So I was really looking to find a really inviting and encouraging way to open some space for my readers to engage in some self-reflection, which is what I kind of try to show, as I'm writing the book, as I'm kind of going through the book. But I'm just delighted to hear that you found it engaging, and my real hope is that exactly the book will inspire more conversations and will inspire more thoughtfulness. And I say, so many books have been written, so many really excellent books have been written about how to travel more sustainably, more mindfully, more responsibly, like with kind of real how-to guides. And I say in the introduction, I see my book as the kind of prequel to all of those books. Right. I want my book to inspire you, to motivate you to go out and buy those books and to actually put those things into action. But really, I'm kind of getting down a little bit more to the fundamental kind of motivation of the human psyche, but
Right.
to really, inspire behavior change, I guess.
Yeah, you were talking about all the places that you've been and written about. So one of my questions was, how did you decide which places to travel to for this book, or to include? Maybe you excluded some of them.
I did. Oh my gosh, there were 2 whole chapters that I wrote pretty much in totality that are nowhere in the book now. Like not even like a paragraph of them is in the book. Yeah, it was. Let's just say it was a long process. It was a learning by doing process, writing my first book, and so I had to go down some sort of dead ends before I could sort of discover my way to the real path. But but yeah, gosh, how did I decide? I mean, it's so many things. I considered going to so many different places over the course of developing the book proposal and then, writing and editing it. So it was a combination, of course, of some practical considerations, but mainly I wanted to go to places. I wanted to go to a lot of places that people would really recognize and resonate with, and maybe places that they have been before. So I went to choose some pretty iconic tourist destinations. So Amsterdam, Barcelona, Hawaii, Angkor Wat, right? I wanted to go to some places that are pretty really famous, known ones. And I wanted to go to places that were also kind of lesser known or kind of more up and coming or at a different stage in the tourism kind of life cycle. So I went to Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, really sort of very new on the scene in terms of secular tourism. And I went to Liverpool, England, which is kind of a more recent tourist destination, like in the last generation or so. And I went to Kerala in South India, which actually, has been a tourist destination for a while, but they're really in the last 15 years have gone through a deep transformation in how they welcome visitors in their community. So I wanted to get a broad spectrum of really well-known, not so well-known, kind of newer places, older places, and just places that I found interesting, really places that I found captivating and I thought readers might enjoy a little trip to as well.
Yeah, I definitely I could imagine this all as one of those I feel like there's a lot of travel documentary shows now where you're following a celebrity and they're traveling all these places. That's what's in my head. I'm I want to see all this. I think I've been to Hawaii and Liverpool, which are very separate, opposite things. But your experience in Liverpool, or your chapter about Liverpool, was very interesting. I didn't know that it had transformed so much. One of the themes of the book is how tourism can positively transform a place, and Liverpool was, I think, one of the only ones that really stood out.
Yeah, I mean, Liverpool, I think, is really fascinating because it was a city that a lot of British people now, even today, if you ask somebody from London who's kind of maybe age 40 and older, what do you think of Liverpool? You might get Liverpool. It was known in the 80s and 90s as a haven of kind of heroin addiction and violent crime, and one of the poorest. I think it was in the early 90s that that it was declared one of the poorest urban areas in Europe. So really, and it had a lot of kind of riots and stuff in the 80s, and it was really not a kind of a place that people would think of as a tourist destination unless you were a really hardcore Beatles fan. But they needed to revitalize their waterfront, which was no longer a big shipping hub. And they decided in the 80s that they, being the local government, to really lean into tourism. And so they built the Tate Liverpool, which is this, absolutely world-class modern art museum right on the waterfront. And that was really the beginning. And Prince Charles came in 1988 for the unveiling, and it was all over national news in the UK. And this was really the beginning of Liverpool's kind of transformation. And now the the income and that they've earned through tourism and the international reputation that they've garnered through their tourism is really has transformed the city completely. So I wanted to tell that story, but then at the same time, that is kind of, had I gone to Barcelona and say 2005, I could have written that story about Barcelona, right? So it's kind of different, because do we know that Liverpool's, on one hand, we don't know whether Liverpool could become the next Barcelona or Amsterdam. I mean, probably not, but one never knows. So yeah, there's, Barcelona also had a huge success story with tourism, but then it got out of hand. And so I think one of the messages that I want to get across to readers is, and sometimes in reading kind of media about tourism, you get a sense that people are blaming tourists, for oh, tourists stop going to all these places that are overcrowded. And yeah, we need to make thoughtful and informed decisions. But a lot of places, including Barcelona and Amsterdam, that have struggled with too high tourist numbers, the governments in both of those cities spent a lot of money and a lot of time doing everything they could to attract as many visitors as possible to their cities. And then it was only they failed to kind of create the regulation and the infrastructure to welcome all of those people in a way that was sustainable. So I want to, I think, of course, we have some responsibility as travelers, but also the governments. I mean, the buck really stops with the governments in a lot of these cases. Yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting to read too. I have never looked into what type of rules might be in place. I mean, I feel like it's kind of how would anyone know if a place is going to have too many tourists eventually, like, or like how many is too many. One of the I what was one of the success stories, I guess, about some government mandates that happened that helped make sure that the locals and tourists were not uh
In
issues.
conflict with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're okay. Well, I mean, Kerala, India is definitely a success story. So this is a place on the south, like near the very southern tip of India. And it's a state with a population, I think, about the size of California. So, I mean, it's like, huge population, beautiful kind of white sand beaches right along the coast, wonderful cuisine. And the state of Kerala, I think the number is, I think it gets around 16 million tourists a year. Most of those are other Indian tourists, but it gets about 1 million international visitors a year. And starting around 2007, 2008, the local residents in Kerala really started to speak out against the local tourism industry, because the kind of tourism that was happening at that point was really like big kind of beach resorts lining up on the beach. And the resorts were importing all of their, kind of soft furnishings and food, either from overseas or from other parts of India. And they weren't hiring local people; they were importing their sort of staff. And then there's some beautiful lagoons, kind of like backwater lagoons there, where you can go on a lovely kind of boat ride and stuff. And the locals were just finding these lagoons were becoming inundated with litter and trash. And this is where they fish. And, so the locals were really upset. And there were even anti-tourism protests in Kerala. And this is a part of India that's really known for its kind of the importance of local self-government. And the leaders in Kerala really listened. They hosted a responsible tourism conference in 2008 and brought in international experts, including Dr. Harold Goodwin, who's really the expert on a lot of these responsible tourism practices. And they changed. They launched some pilot projects to see, okay, how can we do this? Like, how can we encourage the hotels to work with the local community? How can we encourage the local community to get involved in tourism in a way that will work for them? And they came up with some pilot projects that were really successful. And I describe kind of taking part in one of these in the book. I think it's in chapter 4, where they've set it up so it's all locally run and locally managed, and you can go and experience kind of life in a village, but in a way that, it did not at all feel voyeuristic. It did not at all feel exploitative, because the local panchayat, which is the local sort of like town, city or village council, they were the ones who set the prices, who determined who are going to be the tour guides and what the activities are going to be. So this is really run at a super local level, and they're inviting people in. And so I went and I, got to sort of practice like weaving a basket. I got to sort of make some coconut rope, fiber rope from sort of coconut husk fiber. I got to drink some toddy. They call it like the local palm wine. And, and these kinds of, I got to try to climb a palm tree. I didn't actually write about that in the book, but with a little sort of like machine was a little bit sketchy, but it was okay. And it was wonderful. And it felt so like, I'm really like getting a view into this very other way of living that, and so that was really wonderful. And that is all because, that exists because the locals who were really unhappy 15, 16 years ago, I mean, not that long ago, spoke out and told the government we need something else, and the government listened, and they came up with this pilot project. And now Kerala is really a leader in India for responsible tourism, and they're trying to sort of learn how to advise other people on kind of responsible tourism practices. So that's a really good news story that I was really, really happy to see.
Yeah, that reminds me of the story in the book, kind of what I hope the end of Hawaii's story is, because you start talking about.
Of course, that's another good example. Yeah. But
yeah, that one kind of hit me the hardest, just because it is part of the United States. Most of our audience for Porchlight is in the United States, and I mean, I think a lot of people have been. No one's blind to the fact that we shouldn't be visiting Hawaii, or it should be a little. You should think harder about what you do there and things, especially with the fires. But the fact that So in the book, everyone who's watching, Paige talks about how basically the Hawaii State Marketing Board, they hire an organization to market Hawaii to the outside, like to get people to come and visit Hawaii. And they have historically hired this firm that's really big, maybe has like a bunch of white guys on it probably.
Well, the
And
CEO is a Caucasian man. Yeah.
yeah. And then they hired very recently, I think, they hired like a local nonprofit made up of locals, but that nonprofit didn't have experience with marketing. So then the like firm got angry and maybe sued for unfairness, right?
I mean, it was a huge, and this was really, so I was in Hawaii to report for the book in the summer of 2022. And I'll just add, my sister has lived in Honolulu since 2003. So I've been to Hawaii a lot over the years to visit her, and it's been fascinating. And she doesn't have anything to do with tourism. And, you know, my brother-in-law, they have nothing to do with, you know, they don't work in the tourism industry or anything. So it's been interesting kind of going and visiting my sister and seeing the kind of resident way of life. And then also, of course, you know, I would do touristy things when I would go, and kind of seeing the complete dichotomy, it struck me, between like my sister's life and what a tourist would experience in the same place. But yeah, no, this issue, it was really hot when I was there in the summer of 2022, and it's still, you know, being hotly debated now of, yeah, who gets the marketing contract to tell the story, really to sell the story of Hawaii to potential visitors. And yeah, since the very beginning of tourism in Hawaii, it's been the Hawaii Visitors and Convention Bureau that does this. And it's like $100 million contract over many years. And a couple of years ago, instead of the contract going to the Visitors and Convention Bureau, it went to the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, which is like a Native Hawaiian, you know, nonprofit that didn't have, you know, this kind of like huge, like vast tourism marketing experience that, of course, the other agency did. And so, yeah, there was a dispute over whether the contract was fairly awarded. And this, when I was in Hawaii in the summer of 2022, this was like an active, nobody would talk to me about it because it was kind of an active, ongoing dispute. But it was very much kind of the elephant in the room. And it really goes to, you know, I mean, Hawaii. And so I wrote the most about Hawaii of any place in the book. I have kind of 3 different sections where I really kind of meet different people and describe what's going on there, because I think, you know, they have such a deep history of tourism there, and it's really in a state of flux. And the appointment of John DeFries, the first Native Hawaiian to head the Hawaii Tourism Authority in 2020, I think was a really important moment. And so I spent a lot of time with him. John, who was born in Waikiki in 1951, and who has been working in hospitality in Hawaii, you know, most of his adult life. He has a really interesting perspective and is trying to sort of balance the voices of the, you know, needs and priorities and values of, you know, his Native Hawaiian community and heritage with the economic, you know, driver that is tourism in Hawaii. So he's really kind of trying to balance both. But then I spent time with a Native Hawaiian man who was very overtly anti-tourism. And I met him at a Native Hawaiian conference. I heard him speak, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, "Hi, I'm Paige. I would love to hang out with you. Is that okay?" And so he said, "Yeah." And he was incredibly polite, incredibly gracious, incredibly friendly. And he took me around his hometown and he showed me his side of the story. And I put that in the book, not because I want to, like, am I going to go to Hawaii again? Like, yeah, I mean, my sister lives there. And what I, you know, like, you know, it's not for me to decide whether other people should, you know, go to Hawaii or not. That's for each of us to decide. But I just thought, here's a voice, the voice of this man, like that ought to be included in the discussion in a way that I haven't seen it included in the discussion outside of Hawaii, especially so far when thinking about tourism. So it's complicated in Hawaii. But then I finished the book with one of my favorite kind of scenes or moments in all of my travels, which was just a moment of profound kind of inspiration about like kind of the right way forward for tourism in general, and especially tourism in Hawaii. And I met a woman, Cindy Punahaole, who was just a real inspiration. And so I wanted to finish on a positive note. And the most positive note I found in my travels happened to come from Hawaii, and also the most negative, probably, with Kuike telling me tourists need to go away now. Both of those came from Hawaii. So it's a place, an important place, and one that merits, you know, some thought, right? Some thought and some time to educate ourselves before visiting.
Yeah, actually, you answered one of my other questions about how you meet these people, because I'm always interested in that. I'm like, you're literally just going up to people and asking.
Yeah, literally. Yeah. I mean, like having been a journalist for a while, you get used to like, you're going to cover something and you're kind of standing around and you're like, okay, I need to get my quote. Oh my God. Like, and you just walking up to people and like, hi, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. Hi, I'm here to learn about this. Would you mind like taking some time to chat, or like, can I get your phone number? Could we like connect over coffee later or whatever it is? Yeah, it's a lot of just walking up to people. And that's Kuike. Yeah, he spoke at this conference, and I went specifically because I wanted to like interviewed a ton of people at that conference, just kind of like pulling people aside and having chats. And then I sat in on a session that he was speaking on, and then when he finished, I ran up before he could walk away and introduce myself, and then we arranged to meet like the next week or something. That's why it really helps as much as when you can spend longer in a place, it leaves the chance. When I was in Liverpool, I was literally like, I lined up a bunch of interviews, and I went to all my interviews, and that was good. Kind of government people and like tourism people and sort of a social activist guy. None of those people ended up in the book, right? The person who ended up in the book I was standing literally on the Liverpool waterfront. It was kind of the end of the day. I had finished all my official interviews. I was just wandering around. I was going to go find something to eat in a minute. And I'm like looking up at this building, like, wow, that's pretty like amazing building or whatever. And this guy literally just walks up to me and he starts telling me about like the history of the birds on the top of the building. And I look over, I'm like, oh, hi. Oh, that's really interesting. Like, thanks. And he's like, oh, I hear an American accent. And I was like, yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm here to learn about tourism. And he was like, I'm your man. Like, so we ended up hanging out for like 3 or 4 hours, like just kind of wandering around. And like, yeah, like he drove me around a little bit. You have to be careful as a female.
Yeah.
But I was like, I get a good vibe from this guy. I was kind of like, all right, do I have my phone location device on? But yeah, I do that. I mean, that's the kind of thing. I got in the car with Kuike. It's like you kind of have to throw yourself in there. So a lot of it is kind of happenstance, really leaving yourself open and being a solo traveler, which, it makes it easier to kind of have these encounters. Or like the woman I interviewed at the Justin Bieber Canyon in Iceland. I interviewed like kind of government and tourism people in Reykjavik, and then I just went out there, and she was there on site, and I just walked up, and she was on the job, so we were kind of chatting as she was. I kind of shadowed her for a while, and we kind of did the interview on the hoof, as it were. But yeah, so going and looking, and it's my favorite part of the job. I love like to have an excuse to go up and ask people, random people, to tell me about themselves and their lives and their work. I'm just really nosy.
No, it turned out great. I mean, you must, like you said, you didn't even use those interviews with people in Liverpool, but like the ones that you do include, they just seem like you picked the perfect people to be telling these stories. Like I really, besides the guys in Hawaii that you talked to, I thought Brad, the mountain guide, was really
he's great. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you decided? I think it's interesting. It kind of felt like you were doing the interview with him basically while you were like climbing a glacier.
Exactly. That was the idea. I was like, Brad, can I hang out with you for a day? And we'll like go on and it's a classic sort of journalist technique, right? Like, let me go sort of shadow you and do the interview so I can describe you. And it's like, classic sort of magazine journalism. Let me, if you're writing a profile of somebody, you want to go like do something with them. So the reader is learning about the person, both through the words that are coming out of their mouth that you're either paraphrasing or putting in quotation marks, and through how I'm watching him move and what he's doing. And, so it just makes for more interesting reading and a different perspective for the reader. So I'm like, okay, how can I give my reader a good time? Is like inform them, educate them, and give them a good time. So Brad is fascinating. He's an American. He grew up in Vermont, but he's lived and he's in his like mid 30s now. But he's lived in France since he was 20 years old. So he really comes across, like when he speaks French, he sounds to me almost completely French. Like I speak good French, but his is like, he sounds almost like, native speaker. And he was the first non-European to be inducted into the mountain guiding company in Chamonix. And he has a PhD in ecology. So he's a mountain guide and an ecologist. And I thought he would be the perfect person to kind of talk to about climate change and tourism, because as a mountain guide, what is he? He's a tour guide, right? He takes tourists through the mountains. And And he is part of like a small task force within the company of guides in Chamonix that's leading their work on thinking about how they're going to adapt their work to climate change, because of like mountain guides in a lot of ways are really, especially in a place like the French Alps, which are being really affected by climate change quickly, they have to adapt the way they move around in the mountains. They already had to do so much adapting to the change in climate. And so he really had, some really interesting thoughts and kind of some big picture philosophical thoughts, as well as really practical. He's like, there's the practical kind of like route finding and like you avoiding rockfall, which is becoming more common, and, picking the right months to climb Mont Blanc or doing other kind of alpinism, which, are different now than they were 15 years ago. But then there's the bigger picture kind of questions too. And he's like, he really sees mountain guides as an ambassador to the natural world. And his role as a mountain guide is both to guide, a tourist, which in this case was me, right? I hired him as my guide for the day, to guide me through the mountains and to help me kind of contemplate my place in the scene, right? And so that's so it was really interesting to hear his perspective. I mean, we spent the whole day together. I got like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of like my voice recording, right? Like none of that. And like interesting, like you mentioned, like all the other interviews I did in Liverpool. I mean, for any of these places, I talk to so many other people, and most of them don't end up anywhere in the book. Just like any news article I write, I quote, like, the number of people who make it in the article, the number of people I interview, like this is not the same number, right? I interview a whole lot more people than make it in the thing. And I have to have that knowledge. I have to have the bigger picture knowledge so that I know what little bit, what's the right bit to include. Like, and I just have to, it's on me as a writer, as a journalist, to educate myself enough to be able to make an informed decision when I'm deciding what to include and what to exclude, because that's a huge power that we hold as writers. Like, what voices do we leave out too? Because we have to. So,
yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Actually, where anyone watching this will be ready to become a journalist.
It's a good gig if you can make a living doing it. Like, I'm not saying I'm really winning at that one. I mean, I'm getting there. I'm doing my best.
Actually, I could go 3 different questions from this story, but one of the notes I wanted to make is that chapter on doomed tourism was like, that's totally new to me. I'd never heard of that. And it's like so dystopian, and it kind of makes sense like psychologically, but also I'm like, I don't ever need to see a polar bear, whether it's gonna die or not. Like, it's scary. What were your thoughts on doomed tourism in general?
Yeah, doomed tourism, last chance tourism. I mean, this is something that, I had kind of heard about and had come up. And it's interesting in interviews I've been doing for the book. It's one of the most common questions that has come up. I think it kind of captures people's attention or captures their imagination somehow. But yeah, it's this idea that climate change is threatening a number of tourist destinations. Glaciers being the sort of most, maybe visible or iconic. And it's the fact that these places are becoming threatened that, is driving increased interest from tourists in visiting them. So it's like, go see it before it disappears. Sort of, this is your last chance to see, the polar bears in this part of Canada, your last chance to see this glacier, your last chance to see this like this coral reef or something that's bleaching because of climate change. So it's like, wow, okay. And I think I write in the book, it's like for centuries or, human beings have been racing to be the first to kind of get to the top of a peak or document a new, like, landscape or species. And now in some cases we're racing to be the last to be there. And it's, so yeah, kind of, that's kind of dystopian. But some people, I mean, very reasonable people disagree on this, but, some people say, actually, if you come to see a glacier and you see it and it's almost gone, this can be a very striking, very emotional experience, especially, and I've seen this actually among older French people at the Mer de Glace, which is the glacier that I write about in the book. Older French people who visited as school children and then come back and see it again, like in their 70s. Like I've witnessed this myself. They see it and they're like, holy Christ, and just like are really struck by this. And 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 talking to people who work up at the Mer de Glace overlook, they're like, oh yeah, on a daily basis, we see people move to tears by this kind of thing. So it's like, if that visit to that disappearing glacier, if you have an emotional reaction and you understand what's happening there, like that emotional reaction might be enough to inspire some behavior change in you. I mean, this is the kind of the question that the research is trying to get into now. Like, can a visit to a place like that actually inspire behavior change? Or are all the people who come to look at this dying glacier, they're just kind of like voyeuristic kind of tourists who are looking to get something for themselves? It's a complicated question, and I kind of dig into it a little bit in the book, and I reported on that for the New York Times, also in an article I wrote earlier this year, kind of getting into the same question. But it's probably something that we're going to see more of, because of course climate change is changing the world faster and faster every day, it seems like.
Yeah, I don't know. I had to look up what a glacier looked like, because I'm like, I'm probably never gonna see this. So, and it was really cool and not what I expected. And I feel like if I lived closer to one, I would probably, go see it.
Yeah.
Like, I recommend looking up photos if you haven't
Well,
seen.
yeah, here I can show. I don't know if this will show up in the thing, but here's me. This is me on the day I hung out with Brad. That's me.
Oh my
I
god.
described going up this ladder, and that's the
Whoa.
glacier in the background. And then what else do we have here? So this is me. That's Brad up on the ladder right after he had like thrown the rope down to me and looped me in.
No.
If you play the sound, you can hear the wind. And this is me when I'm like, I describe having my freak out moment, which like, holy Christ, I was scared. And then there's Brad on the ladder being like, hey, it's cool, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's like walking on the glacier, you can see it's like kind of some kind of gravel and stuff, and it's now like people who and then there's the glacier kind of with like strewn with gravel and stuff. So it's really cool. I mean, it's unlike anything, obviously unlike anything else. And is this like my, like, if I ever have grandchildren, my kids are like 8 and 10 now. If they have kids, like, the odds are that their kids would never see glacier, right?
Yeah.
So this is, is it kind of, I don't know, should we go value these things before they're gone, experience this landscape before it disappears?
I mean, that's
like, it's complicated.
Right. I mean, that's kind of also the point of reading the book, is like, you do feel like you might even understand these places better through a book like yours, or any sort of book that documents these places and tells you about them. You might understand it more through a book than you would being there, because like one of the other points of the book is like this, I don't know if you have a specific name for it, but like I call it like check the box mentality.
Yeah, kind of like bucket list kind of tick box travel.
Yeah. And like how that it kind of diminishes the sense of a place. And even like you mentioned the Justin Bieber Canyon, which I didn't know. I don't remember this music video, but I had to look it up because I'm like, okay, that makes sense. And then you traveled to the temple that was in Tomb Raider.
Exactly.
I think.
Yep.
And they specifically call it like the Tomb Raider temple, like in the country. Like,
well, that's what, like, my tour guide, I asked him about this on the map of, so this is, in this sort of like the complex around Angkor. On the map, it's not labeled like, Lara Croft Tomb Raider temple. But my tour guide, who was taking me around for the day, he was like, okay, first we're going to go to this one, and then we're going to go to that one, and then we're going to go to the Tomb Raider temple. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was by far the most crowded. I mean, clearly this, it's big sort of, big marketing for for this temple. But no, I think, the influence of social media and, like kind of traditional media as well, and driving people to sites is interesting, and sometimes a big challenge for governments to kind of play catch up on. And I think just like, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily like a good or bad thing in itself, but something that, we should kind of consume with care. And the question about bucket lists, I mean, I think, if it's like, I don't want to say like you should never have a list of things you want to do or places you want to go, but I would just encourage people to be really thoughtful about where that list is coming from. And if it's like, okay, like a list of like top 10 cities in Europe that you found online, or that like, from from a book or a magazine article, I would say like, okay, maybe use that, like draw on that as a starting point for some inspiration. But I would just encourage people to be really thoughtful when they're choosing their destinations, and do a lot of introspection, and just think about like why you want to question, just be skeptical of yourself, like question your motivations. Like, what is it that's pulling me to this place? Like, if I'm honest with myself, is it because I want to get that really cool shot to impress my friends on social media? And like, that's probably going to be a yes in a lot of cases. Like, okay, fine. Like, acknowledge that. And like, don't hide that, like acknowledge that in yourself. And then just, I think, waking up to that is the first sort of thing to do. And then look to see if actually, can you go a little bit deeper than that? Can you find a motivation that's more about lining up with your values, educating yourself about something? If you couldn't post about it on social media, would you still want to go? Like, ask yourself those kinds of questions, I would say, and then make your list after you've done that kind of reflection.
And also, don't act like like it's you're outside of the law when you go to places. I
Oh my
feel
gosh.
like that's in the news so often. And I think I just saw another article reshared from afar by Kathleen Rellahan about
Yes.
like people misbehaving in countries, and like it's like a whole thing that I don't know. Like, I don't understand that either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating. And, kind of like get into these questions in chapter 6 of the book, which is called Tourist Trap, where I write about the Amsterdam red light district, and I write about Disneyland Paris. And I'm saying, like, let's think about, these are two touristy zones where we're really, in a lot of cases, people are going because they're looking for a fantasy. They're looking to occupy a place of fantasy for a little while. And it's like, you know what? Like, of course we all need that. Of course we all need to kind of like escape our day to day. But how do we make sure that when we're kind of escaping reality and looking for kind of a zone where normal rules don't apply, how do we make sure we do that in a way that's not going to like negatively impact someone's everyday life? And so I'm kind of like, yay for Disneyland, because we can go and just wallow in the fantasy. And, we're spending a lot of money, right? But we're not like, it's not like we're making a lot of trouble for somebody who lives in Disneyland, because of course there is no one who lives in Disneyland except for maybe some really hardcore people who camp out or something. But in Amsterdam red light district, you have people going really explicitly to look for that fantasy world and to kind of escape reality, kind of leave the real world behind. And I kind of like, I describe myself doing this in some, in my own little way. And but actually, like, the only problem is when that bumps up against everyday life. So how do we manage that? And of course, in Amsterdam, there's really active debate and kind of active kind of innovations around how to make sure that those two things can coexist. They haven't, like, I would say, like, cracked it completely, but are they working on it? Heck yeah. And are there some really interesting, innovative things happening? Absolutely. So I wanted to go to Amsterdam to kind of see what that felt like and looked like on the ground.
Yeah, I liked that section about Amsterdam where there's a discussion, or there was like some people, I think maybe in the government, who like wanted to move the red light district out of the city center just because that's what was attracting the most like bad tourists. And then there were locals that were like, that's destroying what Amsterdam is. Like, can't we just, it's interesting seeing the back and forth between people trying to figure out what to do to, get rid of, like, manage these problems.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, so the mayor of Amsterdam has proposed one thing, a lot of residents, moving sex workers completely out of the red light district. But residents, every single resident I interviewed in the red light district said, absolutely not. The sex workers are part of our community just as much as the tourists are part of our community. Like, we need to find a way for all of us to work together again, or to kind of coexist together in a way that's mutually supportive. So like, let's focus on coming up with the right kind of rules and regulations to make sure we can all kind of interact smoothly, versus the kind of drastic decision of like changing the fabric of the neighborhood completely by moving out the sex workers. So, but yeah, again, just to really, what I find interesting is that people are engaging in it. And that was kind of what attracted me to that story for the book. And, as a journalist and writer, it's like, okay, this is a place that's really grappling with it. and they have been for a little while now. And so I think this is a place that maybe holds some interesting lessons for other cities. And also, as one of the world's most iconic tourist destinations, it's a place that my readers will probably kind of resonate with or maybe recognize. So, yeah, I loved my time there. It was fascinating.
I think I had this question in mind before and I forgot to ask it, but I wanted to talk about air travel because I feel like that was when I picked up this book, I kind of thought it would be mostly about the environmental the environmental issues of traveling, like physically going by plane and stuff. But it was a pretty short section and it was mostly hopeful. So can you talk about like the issues, I guess, kind of about carbon offsetting and anything else related to like the environmental impact of air travel?
Yeah, I mean, I find it really, an important discussion to have. And carbon offsetting, of course, is something that a lot of travelers think of first when they think of kind of aviation and climate change and trying to sort of make smart choices. This is like where you're paying some money to have like some tree planting in another part of the world. And the idea is that like the money that you're paying is offsetting the amount of carbon that you're producing and taking your trip. And this got a lot of, this was a sort of an approach that got a lot of financing and a lot of attention kind of in the early, 2010s, especially. But it's actually turned out to be, I think, as one expert I interviewed told me, like these carbon credits are like almost entirely garbage. They're just really hard to verify. It's hard to know like that tree planting wouldn't have happened anyway. And so it's kind of really, and he was saying that actually this kind of did more harm than good, creating this system that gave people a false sense of doing something. That's kind of like a not so nice side of the equation. On the other hand, and I was totally, when I started researching this, I was really expecting to come away from the research much more depressed, actually, or much more pessimistic than I ended up being. And I interviewed, he's now at Cambridge, I think, but at the time he was head of like aeronautics. That's not his official title, but like super high up guy at MIT who is working on aviation and the climate effects of aviation, one of the like leading researchers on this, and at University College London, and I interviewed like executives from airlines and stuff on their sustainability practice, and it ended up coming away with like an understanding that actually the world of aviation realizes that they need to cut their emissions completely, and they're actually working on this. And according to like Stephen Barrett at MIT, who I think he's now at Cambridge, he's like, this is technically possible. Like it's the technology for this already exists. Like we can fly with zero carbon. Like we can do that. It's a question of how do you update all of the old aircraft? How do you update the infrastructure? But like, is it physically possible for us to have like a global aviation industry this does not contribute to climate change? Yes. And so when I heard him say that, and I'm like, whoa, Mr. MIT, like, wow, that's not, So, but the issue is, are we there yet? Absolutely not. Do we have a huge way to go to get there? Absolutely. Is the climate in complete crisis already? Absolutely. So like, there's the kind of the time frame is long, but like the whole system has to change. And so I think, putting pressure, I mean, we all need to be thoughtful in how we use air travel and be, deliberate in how we choose to travel and, use trains when we can, other options when we can. And at the same time, the whole system has to transform completely if we actually want to change, have an impact on the amount of carbon like in the air we breathe. That's only going to have, if we want to make a change that the atmosphere is going to feel, that can only happen through massive systems change. And that's what people like this guy, Stephen Barrett, and the other experts I interviewed, this is what they're working on. And this is what they're saying is possible. And a lot of people are working on this. So I was surprised by what I discovered in my reporting, because I really didn't know that much about like the details of this before I started reporting that, on this topic. And I'll be like, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens and how quickly it happens and how much climate crisis we fall into in the meantime.
Great. I will ask. Oh, so we have like 6 or 7 more minutes, I think. Something I wanted to ask was, is there any particular topic in the book that you were like really excited about writing about, and or is there a topic that like kind of naturally you found without realizing you needed it in the book?
That's a great question. And yes, something comes to mind immediately. And that's the story of Lonely Planet, which is how I opened the book. And I really wanted to, when I was kind of thinking, I knew I wanted to have a lot of like travel, I wanted to take people with me on a journey, but I kind of thought, okay, well, before I start kind of going around and looking what's happening in tourism today, I kind of need to bring people to the present moment. Like, how do I help people understand where we are and just how much things have changed in 50 years, like between like 1970, early 70s and today. I mean, the world of travel and tourism, it could not, it's just huge transformation. And so I was kind of just trying to think what's a way into that. And of course, as a writer, you're thinking about how do I tell that as a story, and that you need kind of a protagonist, right? And you need the kind of, and so I'm like, who could my protagonist be for this section? And I'm like, okay, well, Tony and Maureen Wheeler, the co-founders of Lonely Planet, they kind of both narrated the expansion, they kind of lived the expansion of travel and wrote the blueprint for its further expansion with all of their guidebooks. So and I was lucky enough to get to interview Tony Wheeler a couple of times for the book, as well as Rick Steves and Pauline Fromer and Mark Ellingham, who founded the Rough Guides, and Hillary Bratt, who founded the Bratt Guides, and just like really diving into this. And I found it fascinating, just kind of really understanding just how drastically, how transformed the idea, like the idea of like seeing the world, how much that this transformed between the 1970s and the kind of the early 2010s, and how Lonely Planet really shaped so many both individual travelers and so many travel destinations as well. So I really enjoyed reporting that one. I didn't travel at all for that. I did a ton of phone calls and Zoom interviews and blah blah blah, but I didn't travel at all for that one. But I really, really enjoyed understanding and unpacking that history and trying to put it in a bigger context.
I love that too. I'm like, I didn't even know I cared about learning about the evolution of travel guides. Like, I think I've never looked at a travel guide. Like, I travel a lot, but I literally just use Google and Facebook groups. But like,
Can I ask a personal question? How old are you?
28.
Oh my God, there you go. How old am I? I'm 42. When I was first traveling, what did I have? The blue spined Lonely Planet guidebooks, right? Age like 18, 19, 20. Oh yeah. That's what I was using.
Did you carry it? Do you have to carry it with you?
Hell yeah. Excuse me. Heck yeah.
So big.
Well, I mean, or sometimes you get an X-Acto knife and you like X-Acto out your sections and you staple it.
Okay.
I mean, come on. Anyone my age and older, like they remember this. They remember we did this. Yeah.
That chapter did make me want to look at travel guides, though. I'm like, maybe it'd be nice to see, because that's the thing with the internet. You go down rabbit holes upon rabbit holes of what the best things are to see. And I'm like, oh, it'd be nice to see it in a book based on like this editor's recommendations. Like my brain would be so much less frazzled.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's a way of like curating. And actually, like Pauline Fromer and Rick Steves, who I interviewed, both told me that their guidebook sales are back on the rise, are increasing again. And I think it's because, there's so much, like you go online and of course it's just an onslaught, but especially with like really respected brands, and Rick Steves still goes to Europe every summer to research his books. And like, this is something that's been ground truth. And so you have a kind of, an advisor who's curating things for you. So I think, that's maybe what people are finding appealing about books, guidebooks these days. But yeah, give it a try. I'd be curious to hear what you think.
It'd be cool to see one just for like the local community too. I think about, because we're based in Milwaukee, and Milwaukee's not like a tourist destination or anything, but it is like, it's been on more lists recently. So yeah. I'm like, I saw a group of people the other day downtown, all with like big headphones on, and they're like looking around. They're obviously like listening to history. I'm like, what are you learning? Like, I want to know what's going on here, because to me, this is just a shopping district full of expensive clothes. So I'd be interested. Actually, related to travel guides, we had one person give us a question that was, do you have any advice on how to find an agent for a travel book?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I can share my story. And I don't know, I guess it really depends on what kind of travel book you're thinking. But I got the idea for my book yeah, it was really in 2020 that I kind of got the idea. And in early 2021, I just started kind of writing it down. And then I approached literary agents. I approached a couple of dozen literary agents, and you just by Googling, and you can often find, listings of agents, and they'll often say like how they like to be approached. Well, first of all, look at like the kind of books they like to represent, and how they like to be approached. Pro tip: if there's a book written that's similar to the book you want to write, look in the acknowledgments, and the person will always thank their agent in the acknowledgments. So look at who they thank. They might not even call them their agent, but it's pretty easy to sort of suss out. And approach that agent, and approach them with a query letter. And you have to kind of write at least a big chunk of a book proposal, if not a whole one. So Google how to write a nonfiction book proposal. This is what I did. There are a lot of resources there. And then approach a bunch of agents. I kind of just cold approached a bunch of agents and heard back from not most of them, but some of them. And then had some phone calls, and then ended up going with my beautiful, wonderful agent, Veronica Goldstein, who has saved my life. I can't tell you how many times. So kind of like query agents. And once you get an agent, then you're really you're in an expert hands. They know what they're doing. Listen to your agent. They will help you. Always listen. Yeah, Veronica, I listen to you. So, but yeah, just Google, find a list, cold email, write a good query letter.
That's less complicated than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's not rocket science. If I can do it, you can do it.
One more question. So if people like this book, what books do you recommend they read before or after reading it?
Fantastic question. Thank you so much for that one. I always love to recommend the book, The Last Resort. Let's see if I can get the subtitle right. A Chronicle of Paradise, Profit, and Peril at the Beach by Sarah Stadola, who I think this book was published almost exactly 2 years ago, if I remember. And Sarah really focuses on, the history, the evolution of, beach tourism. So beach resorts, which isn't something that I kind of write a little bit about Hawaii, but not, beaches exclusively. And she does a mix of kind of journalism and narrative reporting. But again, she's a real kind of beach, person. And so she kind of gets into the history of the beach resort, which, and implications of the beach resort and how this is evolving. So I think that's a really, really interesting book that's well done. I got to say the Rick Steves book, if Travel as a Political Act, he publishes a lot of books, a lot of guidebooks, but he also wrote this Travel as a Political Act where he really kind of sets out his travel philosophy. And that's an excellent book as well. So yeah, maybe those two I would recommend.
I'm reading The Last Resort right now, and it's really great. It really fills in, with this book, it gives you an even more expansive idea of how tourists have affected just regular old places. Apparently nobody liked the beach before, and now it's the number one thing you can do.
I know, isn't it amazing? Reading that, I was really oh my God, yeah, why does the beach represent the ultimate kind of pleasure place? How did that happen? And so she's kind of a little bit more looking at sort of history and sociology, but it's really fascinating because it's a part of life, a part of the culture that it's so easy to just completely take for granted. And she kind of picks that apart. So I really appreciate that about her book, especially.
That's all. It's been an hour, I guess. We basically talked about a little bit of everything in this book, but I think to really understand, it's so fun to read this book. As I was saying, it's written from a first person POV most of the time, and it's just literally you're Paige's, you're in the passenger seat of Paige's car that she's taking. I don't think you're in a car very much, but you know what I mean.
Not so much, yeah. But you're my wingman. You're my travel mate. Yeah.
It's amazing, and it'll change everything you think about travel, and hopefully you'll keep traveling and be thoughtful about it. So Thank you so much, Paige, for writing the book and answering all these questions.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll just say as a final note, I always love to hear from readers, and I would love to hear what you think, or if you have a book club and you'd like me to speak, I love that kind of interaction. So you can find me on Instagram, Paige McClanahan, or my email address is hello@paigemcclanahan.com. Like, really, send me an email. I will respond to you. Send me a DM. I will respond to you. I would really love to connect with readers. So don't be shy.
Yes, send her emails. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you for having me.